And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Family Matters. The status of COVID-19 in the country is what we talk about tonight. And my guests are ready. One of them is live here on our studios, Colonel Oguna, the government spokesperson. And I'm also speaking with Godfrey Ndungu, who is coming to us live from Mombasa County. It's good to see you, Godfrey, and also welcome to the show. Cyrus Oguna, I'm also welcoming you to our show. Probably I can start by asking you let's begin with the latest. Today we saw 22 more cases of COVID-19 being announced by the Health CAS, Dr. Rashid Aman, and of course this is from the over 1,000 samples that were collected. But when we get to test about 3,000 samples or 2,000, then we are getting higher number of positive cases. Beginning with you, Colonel Cyrus Oguna, the numbers as we see them increasing, is it because of the mass testing that we are doing, because there is a confusion, or it's Kenyans who are flouting the government guidelines?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I would like to start by wishing our Muslim brothers Eid Mubarak as they celebrate the end of the holy month of Ramadan. Now, regarding that question, is a combination of factors. One is that the numbers are rising because indeed we have ramped up our testing capability. The more you test, certainly the more you're likely to find to be positive. But the other aspect of it is that initially our interventions were focusing on trying to stop importation of the virus. But the virus eventually got its way into the country and began to spread within our communities. So the number that we're seeing is because the virus is actually right now firmly within the community.
All right, thank you for that. And Ndungu, let me also engage you. In the last 24 hours, we saw 9 more cases of COVID-19 announced from Mombasa County. And of course, areas like Mvita, they have been recording most cases of COVID-19. Would you also agree with the government spokesperson that the numbers are increasing because there is a ramped up testing going on in Mombasa County, or what could be the problem?
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'd like to echo what our government spokesman has just said. The numbers are risen because of the targeted mass testing, and this is due to the activeness of the response teams with working hand in hand with the contact tracing team. Thereby, we are doing the target testing. Thereby, we have increased the number of positive cases.
All right. Thank you for that. Let me stay with you. You have been at the front line, Godfrey, especially in the fight for this COVID-19, responding to COVID-19 patients. And also we do understand that Mombasa County has also quite a number of fatalities from the 51 that we have. As a clinical officer, someone who is at the front line, tell us how things have changed for you as healthcare workers. How is that experience like?
Okay, my experience as a clinical officer, at first it has been traumatizing, whereby you see handling this pandemic, it has not been there, and just we were sent to the battle, and we thank God because as days went by, we were able to get by, and our county government, we thank God, our governor supported us through meetings, through public participation, and with that, we have been able to conquer well. And though the journey has not been that smooth, we still having a lot to do, and we really appreciate the effort of the county government through the various departments in enabling us, the frontiers, to work hand in hand.
All right. I'll get back to you, Godfrey, but thank you so much for that, let me get back to you, sir. Once again, I'm welcoming you to the show, and thank you so much. Talking about the healthcare workers, because we are speaking with a clinician, let's talk about the challenges that they have been highlighting, especially on the personal protective equipment. I know there is a global shortage, but they have been decrying that we cannot continue being at the front line when ourselves we are not protected. How far is the government? What are you doing to ensure that every person at the front line, at least, they are protected from also getting infected?
Now, our healthcare workers are actually our frontline soldiers. They are the ones who come into contact with, those of us who test positive of COVID. And therefore, their safety and their well-being becomes our first priority. We do appreciate that in the initial days, we had issues with getting PPEs because of the disruption of the global supply chain. Everybody at the time wanted, the PPEs. But again, like you also say, certain times, whenever every cloud has got a silver lining. So even though we had issues of getting these PPEs from outside, we looked internally and we were able to discover that we actually have got, large potential in the country. So right now we are manufacturing these PPEs locally, and therefore there is no shortage at all as we are speaking. In fact, we have so much of it, from that have been bought by the government itself and even from well-wishers. So all healthcare workers right now have, sufficient PPEs to be able to protect them. Indeed, you recall that about a week ago, the Minister of Health, sent a team to Namanga through Kajiado, of course, and they took their a consignment of PPEs to the healthcare workers in Kajiado. Two days ago, another team went to, including the Minister for Health, went to Machakos, and again with another consignment of PPEs. So really, as far as protection of our healthcare workers, there's no problem with that.
All
we
right,
have sufficient PPEs to be able to ensure that they work not only under sufficient protection, but also in an environment and condition that ensures that they are well protected.
All right, government spokesperson confirming that as of today, all frontline healthcare workers have the personal protective equipment, and there's no shortage in the country.
We have enough in the country. There's no shortage whatsoever because we're producing them there. And I may also hasten to add, but the ones that we're producing here today in the country are of much, much better quality than even some of the ones that we're importing.
All right, let me get back to you, Ndungu. Thank you again for staying with us and to have been at the front line. I saw in some of the pictures shared by the county government of Mombasa, having to deal with the patients and, of course, also with, unfortunately, the people who've lost to the virus. That must have been disturbing. Tell us the psychological impact, because there have been calls to help healthcare workers, especially the ones at the front line, with some sort of psychological support. Godfrey, can you hear me?
Handle such scenarios. We thank God because also the positive patient and all those that have been taken to the quarantine before they are admitted to the various places, being given the counseling sessions, and so far we appreciate the efforts of the county government.
All right, and finally, before I let you go, we have the government spokesperson right here. As a frontline healthcare worker, what is this one request that you would make to the government for you probably to be comfortable as you stay at the front line in the fight against COVID-19, Godfrey?
Thank you. First, we want to appreciate that the fact that they are providing adequate PPEs, and that for sure we thank God for that. And we really need more to be there, and participation of other providers like the CHVs, but we will reach more to the community. And so we request employment of more clinicians and other healthcare workers to handle this pandemic and other issues to arise. And our appeal as clinical officers, as healthcare workers, is to have better employment terms than temporary and the contracts, whereby some have already qualified, but they are employed as interns. And one more thing that we may request is harmonization, the risk allowance across all the healthcare workers.
Okay. Godfrey Ndungu, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for speaking to us from Mombasa County. Of course, we'll be having a look at some of those issues. Do have yourself a good night, and God bless for being part of Family Matters tonight. Okay, and Kano, let's finish up with the healthcare providers, because there was a welfare package that was directed or released by the head of state to just ensure that the frontline healthcare workers are comfortable. But last week we saw a cadre claiming that they're being sidelined and they actually wanted to go on strike. Thanks, there have been talks to it.
Really, healthcare workers comprise several segments within the health system, and there is no cadre that has been left out, really. All of them have been taken as one entity, and the package, the welfare package, encompasses all of them. But there is none of any element within the entire ecosystem of healthcare working team that has been left out. Mm-hmm. So the package is looked at in totality, and when it is ready, it will be rolled out to all of them.
Okay.
Yes.
Now let's get to the status of COVID-19 in the country. The first case was reported on the 12th or the 13th of March, and since then we've been seeing so many cases of COVID-19, and of course guidelines being put up by the Minister of Health and the government. But why are we 3 months on, 73 days on, why are we still not on top of the game? Do we say that the curve is flat or at the surge? People want to understand, actually, most of them asking, when is this ending?
Okay. We are actually on top of the game, and I'll explain to you why. If you recall, according to the projections that were given out by experts, that by the end of April, we're supposed to have hit 10,000 mark of infections. Now, by the end of April, we're not even 1,000 of infections. So really, that would indicate that our responses and even our interventions, measures to try and contain the infections, have been working. Because if that was not the case, we would have been talking about several, tens of thousands as of now. Mm-hmm. We're only talking about 1,200 and something. That indicates that really our responses, our intervention measures are actually working. Mm-hmm. But we must also say that, this is not to mean that we've actually been able to completely contain infection, because you can still see the numbers keep on going up and down and going up. And all we can ask, every Kenyan is that this is not a war that should be expected to be fought by the government. It's a war that must be fought by everyone. And indeed, to be sincere, this is a war that must be fought by individuals, not by the government. The government's role here is just to coordinate and direct. But every one of us, in fact, even though we have been saying that the frontline, soldiers are actually the healthcare workers, but realistically, each and every one of us is actually the frontline soldier. Mm-hmm. So the healthcare workers should be actually in the second row of defense. But the first row of defense is actually individual Kenyans. Mm-hmm. So if you are to take responsibility into this fight, that all advisories and all measures that have been put, advocated for by the Minister of Health are followed to the letter, then you don't even need to go to the hospital. Mm-hmm. Maybe one of two or a few would go to the hospital.
So right? For the many cases that we're seeing, we are saying that Kenyans have not taken the front line in the fight against... A large
majority of Kenyans have actually complied. Mm-hmm. And that is why we are seeing, the numbers are not as large as had been predicted earlier on, because of the compliance, measure that most of Kenyans have been able to demonstrate. But we must also acknowledge that there are few who are yet to be able to join into the fight. But we are, saying largely that a critical mass of Kenyans are actually complying, and that's why we're seeing the numbers are not rising as fast as they should have been.
And if Kenyans continue to comply, when do we expect to have our curve flat?
You cannot predict what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after, but all you can say is that let Kenyans continue to complying. And as we follow the guidelines and the measures that have been put in place, certainly the curve is going to flatten out completely. All right? But as of now, we are still seeing surges here and there based on the fact that majority are complying, but a few are not complying. And those few that do not comply also undermine the effort of those who are complying.
Yeah, and most countries have demonstrated that mass testing could really help in determining the actual number of people who are positive and flattening the curve. But still, 3 months on, we are testing 2,000, 1,000. We keep on saying we have the capacity to do this.
Let me also clarify about the aspect of mass testing. Maybe that term has been used loosely. Yeah. Mass testing in the way people want to imagine is like going out to some place and then people just come en masse and then they are tested. But that is not necessarily what we are doing as government. What we are doing is targeted testing, whereby you go to a certain area that has demonstrated that there are infections in that place. And then you contain that area, test people there. Anybody who tests positive, then the contacts are traced. And by doing such, you're trying to ensure that you cordon off that place so that the virus do not spread to those who may not have been infected. That is what we are doing. But we also acknowledge that there have been certain challenges as far as getting test kits are concerned, all right? And that is why a few times we'd see us going to 3,600 and then other times coming down to maybe 1,100, like that. But these are issues that are, of course, brought about by the global supply chain. However, we are trying to work around them so that we can ensure that we have sufficient test kits in the country.
All right. In other words, what you're saying, because it's a target testing, we as a country do not have a target of the number of people we want to test in a certain period, because so far we are at 59,000 people. Yeah.
Right now, we have 20 labs that are able to test. And we can test as many as 7,000 in all those 20 labs that are spread from all the way from Busia to Mombasa, including 2 mobile laboratories that were installed recently. One, of course, at Namanga border post. Another one is destined to go to Naivasha ICD, all right? So we have that. But even with that kind of facility and capability in country, but the reagents are not there, all right, in sufficient quantities. And therefore, what I'm saying is that we can test as many as 7,000, in upward of 7,000, but you need the testing kits. We do not make them locally, and you have to, to order for them from abroad. So sometimes you order about maybe 20, 30,000, and you only get 15,000, right? Because of disruption within the global supply chain. But the fact that many other countries are also going for the same. And that is the challenge that we have. But in terms of in-country capacity, we have sufficient capacity.
Yeah, and that's why people keep on asking why we are not testing as many people as possible. So if we can test, we have the capacity to conduct such tests, the target testing, but right now we lack the reagents.
Maybe using the word lacking is not appropriate.
Yeah, inadequate.
Because we don't lack. It's only that we have the money, but then because of supply and demand issues and the global supply chain disruptions, what we order sometimes is not exactly what we get. But we keep on getting, and as we get, then we ramp our testing. When they run out, we get more. And that's what we've been doing, all right? But if you have to get like 100,000, you'll be able to test 7,000 every day.
Is it a challenge that we could see any solution soon?
Yes, we're trying to get it from different, supply, locations that have been approved by WHO. And as soon as that happens, we'll be able to get as many, testing reagents as possible.
All right. There's the question of the restrictions that have been imposed by the government. Of course, we saw the extension of the dusk to dawn curfew to the 6th of June, including the inter-county movement, especially on the Mombasa, Nairobi, the coastal counties, Nairobi and Mandera County. Most Kenyans are asking, when are we seeing this coming to an end? Because, of course, we'll be talking about the economic impact of the COVID-19.
Indeed, as with regard to when restriction of movement in and out of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kilifi, Kwale, Mandera would happen, it depends on a lot of factors. I must tell you that is always a consideration is on the table, it's being looked at every single day. But as to when it will happen depends on a number of factors. Remember, the coordinating committee is actually called NAC, National Emergency Response Committee. And this committee comprises so many other agencies that look at the developments every single day, including experts from the private sector. So every development is looked at very, very keenly to determine where we are heading. And therefore, that NAC recommends action to be taken. And therefore, based on what they are seeing, the assessment being made, the evaluations, then they'll be able to recommend with regard to when a restriction can be lifted. And I'm aware that the head of state did indicate yesterday that, yes, there's a possibility of that. But he was also very quick to add that we must continue to comply. Yes.
And
so if we don't comply, it certainly becomes very, very hard to lift them, because then we'll see infection going up, and we cannot risk the lives of Kenyans. And
the 6th of June is one after actually the week that begins tomorrow. The other week we're expecting to get to the 6th of June. There are discussions ongoing, and I know you're part of the discussions. The restrictions, or the tough restrictions that were imposed, let's say last month, it was because of the number of cases that were being reported in the country. But right now you've said that most Kenyans are adhering to these guidelines. Probably the discussions, are we seeing any positives coming from a discussion that I think now this is happening? Kenyans are now understanding what COVID-19 is, because we also need to, there was a strategy by the head of state to reopen the economy. Yeah.
And
should we remain optimistic on
that's
that
what I'm
regard?
saying, that this committee evaluates developments day by day. And on the basis of that evaluation, then they recommend action to be taken. It is not a one-man show. It's not a one-man decision. It is a complicity, of many agencies coming together and looking at the various aspects. Remember, people look at COVID as something that has, several elements to it. Indeed, but the core aspect of COVID is actually health. This other aspect of the economy are actually a byproduct of health crisis or health issue. So the moment we fix the health issue sufficiently well, then these others can actually be able to be brought on board and be fixed. But the first one that we must be able to focus our resources, focus our efforts in, is to fix the health issue. And therefore, even as we're talking about economic impact, education, how it has impacted on education, is how a health issue has impacted on this other aspect of our economy. And therefore, this committee I'm talking about looks at how are we progressing as far as the health aspect of it is concerned. If everything looks like we are stabilizing, then other decisions shall be made at the right time.
All right. We'll talk briefly about the economic impact of COVID-19, but on the testing, still on the testing of the patients, we've seen a lot of, especially when we are testing the truck drivers at our border points, there's a lot of delay. There are complaints coming from, especially on getting the results. There is no smooth transition, especially when you're taking goods to the other country or movement. There's even someone who's saying there's no smooth testing and getting your results before you could transition to the next country, get your goods from the port, transport them. What's happening at our border points? Because there have been, in the last few weeks, many complaints, especially from the truck drivers. Some saying they're being frustrated by the neighbors.
There is an agreed protocol regarding how truck drivers are supposed to, be managed. And the protocol is very, very clear that every truck driver must take a COVID test 48 hours before the start of his or her journey. And the COVID test is taken from the point of origin of the journey. For us here in the country, we have several testing locations. If you're starting your journey from Mombasa, you will be tested in Mombasa. If you're starting your journey from Nairobi, the same. From Namanga, the same. From Nakuru, Eldoret, Malaba, Busia, Kisumu, the same. But it must be done 48 hours before you start your journey, right? Once you have been given COVID-free certificate, based on what the protocol says, that the other neighboring countries will be able to respect that, and you'll be given access to go into the other country. The same would apply to the other countries, the neighboring countries, all of them together, right? So the initial delay that was there, of course, going to be sorted out, because this protocol was just agreed about recently. You recall we had issued the neighboring country that was sorted out, amicably, yesterday or the day before yesterday. in as far as how cross-border truck drivers should be managed and treated in as far as COVID testing is concerned. That's what has been agreed on.
Yeah.
So any queues that might have been there is going to be sorted out. And I have also mentioned that at Namanga border, we have gone a step ahead to install a mobile laboratory at the border. So there'll be no point of taking samples anywhere away from the border area. And that's also to be able to shorten the turnaround time between the time the samples are taken and to the time that results are given out. All right? So 48 hours, they'll be able to have gotten their result.
All right. And there are so many cases of COVID-19 coming from the border counties or border regions along the border counties, let's say Kajiado County, Migori County. When the cases of COVID-19 emerged in Nairobi and the coastal counties, there was a cessation of movement that was announced from these counties, but we've not seen the government saying, listen, we'll not now be allowing movement of people from, let's say, Kajiado to another county or Migori to another county. What's happening?
People, well, I think the people that have really been found to be positive, not really all of them are actually, coming or hailing from Kajiado as a county. Most of them are actually truck drivers, and Namanga is actually within Kajiado County. So for those that have been positive, and hailing from Kajiado County, the number is very, very small. But the large number we are seeing, in Kajiado County are actually numbers of truck drivers that have tested positive at Namanga border. You understand? And that's why we are saying that the truck drivers are actually a new high-risk population. And that is why it was necessary to take a mobile laboratory at Namanga. So that is exactly the reason why even these protocols have been developed, to ensure that only a COVID-free driver is allowed to enter onto his vehicle and cross into another country. But if you have not tested for COVID, they'll not be allowed to enter in any neighboring country.
All right. And before the partial lockdown of Isli and Kawangware and Old Town in Mombasa, there were so many cases of coronavirus being reported in those areas. But right now, we are seeing few cases being reported. Is it because the virus has been contained in those areas, or it's again target testing that has become a challenge?
It's target testing, not really a challenge. Target testing is, like I did mention, is that, Old Town was identified as an area that had, demonstrated that several infections in that. And in order to allow, or to contain it from going out into other areas of Mombasa, it became necessary to cordon, to lock it out, so that those within Old Town can be tested there, and those that turn positive to be taken to an isolation facility and be treated, including their contacts. And that is important, because if you do not know where the virus is, then there is no way you're going to combat it. There's no way you're going to fight it. And therefore, the targeted testing was essentially, aimed at identifying areas that could, be termed as epicenters of infection, lock that area out, and then identify those within that area so that they do not spread virus to others within the same areas who may not have been infected, but at the same time to ensure that it is not spread out of such areas to other communes or estates that may not also be having high incidences of infection. Okay. That is why that happened in Old Town and Isli as well.
Let's pick a few questions. On Twitter, Bokea Anthony is asking, why can't the government lift the travel restrictions? Since this COVID is here to stay for long, we need to plan how to live with it.
We have not necessarily, come to that decision that, COVID is here to stay. Indeed, you cannot necessarily, eliminate it entirely. But we are saying that when a smaller number, begins to, to test positive, then we will be able to, take certain measures as that time. But right now, because of the figures we are seeing, the numbers we are seeing, then it will be a bit premature to lift, them entirely. However, like I said at the beginning, there is a committee that looks at all development, and then that committee will determine whether it is appropriate to lift, or they'll advise as necessary, and then appropriate action shall be taken.
William Mamburi is saying, ask him, here in Watamu, we depend on tourism, and since March 1st, I have been suddenly unemployed. I have not benefited from the relief food program by the government. What measures is being taken for our survival?
Indeed, many countries of the world have had the tourist sector impacted negatively. Remember that COVID is something that is transmitted by human beings, and because of that, what you want to limit is movement of human beings, so that those who may be infected would not move around and infect others. Those tourists are actually human beings, and therefore, to ensure that the disease is not spread quickly from one country to another, is to limit international travel. And that has happened to many countries of the world. But indeed, we also appreciate that it has impacted on several service-related sectors. And one of the such sectors is tourism. And many other sectors of the economy have been affected, hotel, transport. And for those that have lost livelihoods, and indeed there are many, the government has gone a step ahead and tried to identify those that are very vulnerable, completely vulnerable, and has provided some kind of social protection to them during this time when the situation is still very bad.
All right, Josephat Musa from Kisii County. My question is there any vaccine development that is going on?
Well, I'm not a doctor really, so I will not be able to address that. But what I know is that if there is or there isn't, we have protocols in the country that will be able to be followed. And once any of such vaccines are found, then we shall be notified as a country, and government will give direction of what needs to be done.
All right. And then Dr. Ogecha is asking, can the government consider reopening the courts to avoid courts in police stations?
Like I said, that there is a committee that is looking at every situation in as far as COVID is concerned, but the core, issue here is health. Once the aspect of health is deemed to have been, sorted out, then the others certainly will follow suit.
At Bairaguba, Kennedy Jr. is asking, what will happen to the foreigners whose visas expired during the lockdown?
Indeed, the government gave out, a window for those who wanted to go back to their countries to go. And there are many countries that came in to evacuate their people, and they went back. But for those who are here and their visa expired, and we understand the condition or the situation under which the visas have expired, of course, certainly they'll be able to explain themselves. The government is a listening government, and they'll be able to take appropriate action that will ensure that they're assisted.
All right, and this other one is a technical question from Tycoon is asking. My question is, if a person tests positive, then taken for isolation, he or she recovers and tests negative, can he or she get reinfected?
Yes, I'm answering that question based on what I have heard, not what I have learned, because I'm not a doctor. But what I've heard is that you can be reinfected between 30 and 50 days. If you were initially, infected, you were treated, you recovered, you tested negative, but within a period of 50 days, between 30 and 50 days, you can be reinfected, especially for those who have got other underlying, conditions.
Okay, let's take another one from Simau Mao on Twitter. We are always told about the number of recoveries. We would like to see them. Indeed,
that is a good question, but again, you must also take, cognizant of the fact that revealing identity of a patient, is a matter of confidentiality. So the patient must be ready, to have his or her identity revealed. But nonetheless, the truth of the matter is, all these numbers we've been talking about, recoveries, positive, those are actual cases that exist. I remember that there was a feature that was carried by one of the media houses of those that have recovered. So yes, there are recoveries. Yes.
And lastly, Charles Kivi is asking, what criteria is the government using to identify the most vulnerable in the society in their cash transfer program?
Yet there's a clear criteria that is used by the government. One of the criteria that I can tell you, right away, that first of all, where you are staying is the number one criteria. Of course, if you're in Nairobi and staying in the areas of Kilimani, you're staying in the areas of South C, South B, areas of Runda, you may not necessarily qualify. But nonetheless, is that it is not necessarily identified by an individual. It is as a committee that is formed at the grassroots level, at the sub-locational level, which is headed by the local sub-chief. And there's also a locational level, which is headed by the chief. They know who among their community is actually vulnerable, right? So the starting point is at the sublocational level, including the Nyumba Kumi. So it is not the national government that would say so-and-so should have been this list, but he is out. That is the responsibility of the people at the grassroots level who interact with that community on a day-to-day basis. They'll know who is more deserving than the other, or than another.
All right, and the person who's asking about the most vulnerable is saying, my question actually is about what the government is doing to cater for those who've already been dismissed from work.
Indeed, the government has done a bit, really, to be able to provide for those that are vulnerable and have lost their livelihoods. But again, I must also add that it is not realistically possible for the government to provide for everyone. Those that have lost their livelihood, but they're still able to provide for themselves. But the government knows that there are those that are completely unable to provide for themselves, right? And therefore, it goes back to the local committee or the local secretariat to determine who at the community level has lost his or her job and is completely vulnerable. Indeed, honestly, we must agree, we are human beings, we are rational people. We know that there are those who really will not necessarily require government support, even though they have lost their jobs. But there are those that certainly will require government support because of having lost livelihood, mamambogas. And that is why the government, in its wisdom, came up with that economic stimulus plan to be able to provide support to those vulnerable members of our society.
All right, and Ruth, allow me to pick one more question from our Facebook page, and this is in regard to a report by my colleague Caroline Kamau on the street children. Someone is asking, ask the government spokesperson, what's the government's measures put in place to care for the less fortunate, especially those on the streets, like that guy, John Mwangi?
Indeed, a good question. The responsibility of taking care of all those street families in every urban center is actually a responsibility that has been delegated to the county government. So I know all county governments have got a plan to ensure that all members of a society that are vulnerable, are in the streets, are actually being taken care of. So there are programs to ensure that they're actually being catered for, even as we fight this pandemic.
Yeah, and health officials have said that social distancing is the most efficient way to prevent spread of COVID-19. But we've seen security officers forcing people to put on their masks, especially in their private cars. Kindly make this clear.
This is let me say it's a question that has come many, many times, and I'm glad that you brought it up so that we can be able to make a clarification. Is that a lot of questions regarding it have come from people who are actually car owners, people who drive their own private cars. And if you are in your private car and alone, and your windows are rolled up, and you're driving, that is completely private. But the moment, assuming that a police officer flags you down and you move by the side of the road and he approaches you and you lower your window, that act of lowering the window transforms that surroundings from being private to being public. And at that time, the police officer has got every right to arrest you, right? Now, the other scenario is this, that you're in your car with other people and you don't have mask. Of course, that is, again, it's no longer private, it is public. The third scenario is that you're in your car, alone, in a jam, and the windows are rolled down. Again, that means that it is no longer private, it is public. And at that time, a police officer can be able to take action against you. Why is that critical? Because once you lower your window and you sneeze or you cough, chances are that you'll be coughing with your mouth directed away from the car or through the window that is lowered. And somebody is passing by, maybe a hawker or something. Of course, you're endangering that hawker's life. And therefore, we are trying to encourage our people to ensure that at all times they have masks, because the mask is intended to protect yourself and the person next to you. It is not aimed at punishing anyone. It's actually intended to promote a good, health behavior.
All right, and lastly, time is not on our side, but I'll also welcome you as you answer this one. Your parting shot is well welcome. Among the testing of COVID-19, testing people for COVID-19, and once they are positive, isolation and treatment, which of these services is the government offering for free?
The government is offering for free quarantine facility. The government is offering for free isolation and treatment facility. Now, testing in certain areas are free, but the government has said that it will be able to provide, subsidize. So for a test that's costing 10, 11,000, you only pay 1,000 bob, right? But quarantine and isolation facility and even treatment is free, right? So people should not worry. But in targeted testing that is being done right now, in targeted testing, it's actually free. So when they come to your location or your estate, they are, waiting for people to come and be tested. Do not be afraid that they're going to ask you for any money. Present yourself. You will be tested at government expense. If you are, unfortunately positive, you'll be taken to isolation facility at government expense. You will be treated at government expense and be let to go home. For the contacts of those who might have tested positive, they also should not be afraid to give out, some of them, from what we've gathered, are actually switching off their numbers, their mobile phones, which is not a good thing, because you may never know that you're already positive, and in the process you end up endangering and even infecting your loved ones. So again, when they are brought into a quarantine facility, it is free of charge. For those who will test positive within the quarantine facility, they'll also be taken to isolation facility free of charge. Right? So the government is actually providing these services, let me say, free of charge.
All right.
Finally,
yes,
is
please.
to ask Kenyans really that this, like I started by saying, that this is not a war that can be fought by the government. It is a war that the government only directs, but it's a war that must be fought by ourselves, the people of this country, by taking responsibility. It is not right that, a matatu is full, yet a matatu is supposed to carry only 8 people. I can count. I'm a rational human being. It is already 8 people in it until I want to be the 9th person. Yet I know the directory. So all I'm asking for is that let's obey, let's comply with the measures that the government has put in place, so that we can be able to flatten our curve as fast as possible.
All right, Colonel Cyrus Oguna, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure having you in our studios tonight, discussing more on the status of COVID-19 in the country. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you very much for inviting
me. All right, and thank you so much for watching our show tonight, for your feedback, your questions, so many of them, but I trust mostly or most of them have been addressed. Once again, I thank you for watching. I'm Purity Musiolensa. Odingo has been our sign language interpreter. Have yourself a lovely night and enjoy the rest of your week ahead.